The day Sallie Walker buried her second husband, she made herself a quiet promise standing there in the red Oklahoma dust with the wind pulling at her black dress and the preacher's words dissolving into the hot summer air. She promised herself that she was done, that the well inside her had run dry, that whatever it was that made a woman open herself up to loving and losing had been used up completely. And she intended to live the rest of her days on the land she had bled for, without letting another man close enough to cost her what she could no longer afford to give. That was in the summer of 1882, and she held to that promise with both hands for the better part of a year. The Walker homestead sat on the eastern edge of Grady County, a stretch of Oklahoma territory that the federal government had grudgingly acknowledged as open land following the Reconstruction era, land that Sallie had fought to claim alongside her first husband, Thomas Walker, before he was taken by a fever in the winter of 1879. She had stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning everything Thomas had dreamed about: the corrals and the spring-fed creek, and the 320 acres of grassland that turned gold in October and made you believe the world was still a generous place, despite all the evidence to the contrary. She had married Edmund Ferris 2 years after Thomas passed, a quiet and capable man who understood cattle and respected her grief, and she had let herself feel something resembling hope again before a stallion took Edmund in the chest on a Tuesday morning in June of 1882, and that was the end of that. Now she had the land and the cattle and a hired hand named Pete Oakes, who was 63 and half-blind in one eye and deeply loyal, and she had her 16-year-old nephew Denny coming out on weekends to help with heavier work, and she had the knowledge, accumulated through years of surviving, that she could manage. She did not need anything else. She did not want anything else. She told this to Clara Simmons at the general store in Chickasha one Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, when Clara raised an eyebrow at the idea of a woman alone on all that land and asked, gentle as she could manage, whether Sallie had given any thought to her future. Sallie set her flour and her salt pork on the counter and looked at Clara with eyes that had gone the color of worn cedar, brown and steady, and a little tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. "I have thought about it considerably," Sallie said. "My future is exactly as I intend it to be." Clara nodded and did not press further, because you did not press Sallie Walker when she used that tone. It was on that same morning, while Sallie was loading her wagon outside the store, that Cyrus Sheridan rode into Chickasha for the first time. He came from the south, which meant he had crossed the Washita River sometime that morning, and the red mud on his horse's legs confirmed it. He was riding a dark bay gelding with a white blaze on its nose, a good-looking animal that moved with the kind of steady confidence that usually mirrors its rider. Cyrus himself was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's tool and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar from the damp heat of the morning ride. He wore a working man's clothes canvas trousers, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a hat the color of tobacco that had seen considerable weather. He had a rifle in the scabbard on his saddle, and a revolver on his hip, and neither of these things made him unusual in Oklahoma territory in 1883. What made him unusual, Sallie noticed despite herself, was that he stopped his horse in front of the general store and swung down from the saddle with the kind of easy grace that came from 10,000 hours in leather. And then he stood there for a moment looking at the town, not appraisingly, not with the calculation of a man looking for an angle, but with a kind of patient curiosity, like a man who was genuinely interested in where he had ended up. Then he looked at Sallie, who was still loading her wagon, and he tilted his hat back slightly. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "Would you know if there is a land office or a territorial commissioner anywhere in this town?" His voice was measured and low and had the faint remnants of somewhere further south, maybe Texas, maybe further. "Office is on the main street, 2 buildings past the barber shop," Sallie said. She did not look at him when she said it. She was adjusting a sack of flour in the wagon bed. "Much obliged," he said, and then, because she had a barrel of molasses that was clearly too heavy for where she was trying to put it, he said, "Would you like a hand with that?" "I would not," she said pleasantly, and heaved it into place herself. He watched her do it without comment, and there was no patronizing quality to his watching, just the frank acknowledgement that she had managed it, and he touched his hat and walked his horse down toward the main street, and Sallie Walker thought absolutely nothing more about Cyrus Sheridan for the next 3 weeks. Then he bought the land directly east of hers. Pete Oakes told her on a Thursday afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man delivering news, he is not entirely sure how it will be received. "Fellow named Sheridan put down on the Alderman parcel," Pete said. "Heard it at the feed store this morning. They say he is from down in Texas, worked cattle down there for about 10 years, saving up, intends to run a cattle operation." Sallie sat in the other chair and considered the eastern fence line through the long afternoon light. "The Alderman parcel runs up against our eastern boundary," she said. "It does," Pete confirmed. "Well," she said, and she went inside and started on supper, and that was the extent of that conversation. She met Cyrus Sheridan properly for the first time a week later, when he showed up at her fence line on a quiet Wednesday morning to tell her that 3 of her Hereford cattle had pushed through a damaged section of fence and were now grazing on what was technically his property, and he thought she would want to know before he had to round them up himself. She pulled on her boots and her hat and walked out to where he was waiting on horseback, and she felt the same involuntary observation she had felt in town, that he was a man who occupied space without crowding it, and she pushed that observation aside efficiently. "I appreciate you coming to tell me," she said. "I will get them back." "I know it," he said. "I just did not want there to be any confusion about the situation." "There is no confusion," she said. "The fence was damaged in last month's storm, and I have been working through repairs in sections. I will get to that stretch today." He nodded, and then, because it was apparently in his nature, he said, "I have wire and posts if you need them. I bought extra for my own fencing. No obligation." She looked at him directly for the first time since he had ridden up, and she saw that he meant it the way it sounded: no obligation, no angle, no agenda. "I have my own supplies, but I thank you," she said. He accepted that with a simple nod and turned his horse back east, and Sallie Walker went and retrieved her cattle and spent the afternoon repairing that section of fence in the dry spring heat. And she thought about the fact that he had come to her rather than simply rounding up her cattle and adding them to his numbers, and she thought about how many men in this territory would not have done that. And then she stopped thinking about it and finished the fence. Neighbors in Oklahoma Territory in 1883 were not luxuries so much as necessities. The land was wide and the distances between towns were real, and when the weather turned or the cattle got loose or a wagon wheel broke on a back road, the person most likely to be in a position to help you was the person whose land touched yours. Sallie understood this without sentimental attachment to it. It was practical. So when Cyrus Sheridan's well casing cracked 2 months after he moved onto the Alderman parcel, and he lost his water source, she sent Pete over with 2 water barrels and told him to tell the new neighbor that he could draw from her creek until the well was repaired, and she thought nothing sentimental about that either. Cyrus came himself the next morning to thank her. He knocked at the door of the house, which Sallie noticed and appreciated, because plenty of men in the territory would have simply called from the yard, and when she opened it, he took his hat off and held it in his hands and said, "Mrs. Walker, I am in your debt for the water. I have a man coming from Chickasha to repair the casing next week. Until then, I will not abuse the privilege." "You are welcome to what you need," she said. "The creek does not run dry until August most years." He nodded, and then he held out a cloth-covered dish that she had not noticed he was carrying in his other hand, and he said, "I made a venison stew last night. I have more than I can eat, and I thought you might want it as thanks." She looked at the dish for a moment. "You cook?" she said, and there was no mockery in it, only genuine surprise, because in her experience men on the frontier could make coffee and fry salt pork and not much beyond that. Something that was nearly a smile moved across his face. "My mother believed it was a survival skill regardless of who you were," he said. "She was correct." Sallie took the dish because it would have been rude not to, and because the smell coming through the cloth was genuinely compelling after weeks of her own practical cooking. "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan," she said. "Cyrus," he said, and then, without pressure, "if that suits you." She considered for a moment and then said, "Sallie," and he put his hat back on and walked back to his horse and rode home. And she ate the stew for lunch, and it was, without question, the best thing she had consumed in several months. Summer came to Oklahoma Territory the way it always did, with a kind of determined ferocity that baked the ground and turned the creeks shallow and made the cattle restless and short-tempered. Sallie had been through enough summers in this country to know how to manage them: early morning work, the hard tasks done before the heat peaked, afternoons for mending and accounts, and whatever could be done in the shade, evenings for sitting on the porch when the air sometimes remembered to be merciful. She and Cyrus developed an unspoken pattern of neighborly exchange that suited them both. When she found a section of his wire fence down that her cattle had pushed through going the other direction this time, she sent Pete to tell him, and had the cattle returned before sundown. When a late summer storm knocked a cottonwood across the road that connected both their properties to the main track into Chickasha, Cyrus came with an axe at first light, and had the road cleared before Pete even knew about the problem. When she was short a hand for roundup because Denny had come down with a summer cold, Cyrus sent 2 of his own hired men over without being asked, because Pete had mentioned it at the creek, and that was how things worked out here. They talked, gradually, in the way people who are both naturally self-contained talk. Not freely at first, not with the rushing quality of people who have been lonely and are relieved to find conversation, but with the careful consideration of 2 individuals who had each learned to value what was true and distrust what was performed. They talked about cattle, and about water, and about the territorial politics that were reshaping Oklahoma with relentless energy as more settlers pushed in, and the federal government drew and redrew its invisible lines across land that indigenous people had lived on for generations, a fact that neither of them could ignore, and which Sallie in particular spoke about with a directness that surprised Cyrus the first time she did it. The Chickasaw Nation held this land for a reason, she said one evening in August when they had ended up at the fence line near the creek at the same time, which happened occasionally with the naturalness of things that are not planned. The government calls it opening the territory like it is a gift, but it was not their gift to give. Cyrus was quiet for a moment, looking out across the grasses that were tawny and still in the evening air. "No," he said, "it was not. I think about that." "Most men do not think about it," she said. "I know," he said simply, and then, after a pause, "Does thinking about it change your decision to be here?" "No," she said, because she was honest. "Thomas and I made that decision together, and I cannot unmake it without undoing everything he sacrificed. But thinking about it changes how I intend to be here." He looked at her then in a way that was different from the friendly, neighborly regard she had become accustomed to over the summer. It was a look of genuine attention, the kind of look that says, "I am not just listening to your words, I am listening to who you are," and Sallie felt it land on her like heat, and she disliked that it did, and she looked away. "I should get back," she said. "Good night, Sallie," he said, and she walked back to her house in the long August dusk and stood in her kitchen for a while doing nothing in particular. It was Clara Simmons who said what was in the air the following Tuesday at the general store, because Clara could not help herself, and also because she genuinely liked Sallie and felt that somebody ought to say something. "People have noticed that you and the Sheridan man are friendly," Clara said, weighing out coffee beans with the casual air of someone who is not at all saying what they are saying. "We are neighbors," Sallie said. "Yes," Clara agreed, still weighing coffee. "Neighbors." "Clara," Sallie said. "I am not saying anything," Clara said, and held out the paper bag of coffee. Sallie took it. "Good," she said. But she sat with it on the drive home, the wagon rolling over the dry, rutted track while the sun came down hard, and the grasshoppers rose and fell in the ditches. And she sat with the honest self-examination that had always been one of her better qualities, even when it produced results she did not particularly want to see. She was not indifferent to Cyrus Sheridan. She recognized that. He was a good man in the specific, substantive way that good men are, not in the easy, surface way that men presented themselves when they wanted something. And she could feel that difference because she had lived long enough to know it. He was patient and capable and thoughtful, and he had a dry, understated humor that came out sideways sometimes when she was not expecting it, and made her laugh before she had time to decide not to. He treated Pete with genuine respect, and he did not ride his horses hard, and he kept his word about the water, drawing only what he needed until his well was repaired. She noticed all of this the way you notice something you are trying not to look at directly, with the peripheral awareness that is sometimes more accurate than the straight-on gaze. But she was tired. That was the truth of it. She was 34 years old, and she had loved 2 men and buried 2 men, and stood in 2 different patches of Oklahoma dirt with the wind in her black dress, and the hollow place in her chest where her grief lived, and the idea of going through any version of that again. Not even the loss, just the opening up, just the making of room inside herself that love required felt like more than she had left to give. She had poured so much of herself into surviving, into the land and the cattle and the daily relentless work of holding things together, that she genuinely was not sure there was enough of her remaining to start something new. That was what she believed. She held it firmly. And then October came, and the grasslands turned gold exactly as they always did, and life in the territory proceeded with its customary mix of beauty and difficulty, and Cyrus Sheridan did nothing to press or pursue. And everything continued to be exactly as Sallie had decided it would be until the morning the Granger brothers rode onto her property and made everything considerably more complicated. The Granger brothers, Dale and his younger brother Holt, were the specific kind of men that the frontier produced in a regular supply, men who had come west with the idea that the absence of established law meant the absence of consequence, and who had built a reputation in the southern part of the territory for the kind of low-grade predatory behavior that was not quite enough to bring the federal marshal, but was more than enough to make their neighbors deeply uncomfortable. They had been watching the Walker property for some time, Sallie had heard, with the idea that a woman alone on 320 acres was an opportunity of some kind, and she had quietly reinforced her own position by speaking very clearly with the Territorial Land Office about her claim and making sure that her paperwork was absolutely in order. But paperwork did not address everything. They came on a Tuesday in October, 2 men on horses, riding onto her property with the casual arrogance of people who have decided that you are smaller than they are. And they told her, Dale doing the talking with Holt hanging back and smiling the unpleasant smile of a man who enjoys the anticipation of things, that they were prepared to make her a fair offer for the Walker land, and that the territory was getting complicated for a woman alone, and that she might want to consider her position carefully. Sallie was standing in the yard with a rifle in her hands because she had seen them coming from the north window of the house, and she had enough experience reading situations to know that this was not a social call. "I am not interested in selling," she said, in the same tone she had used with Clara in the general store when she did not want to be pressed. "I suggest you ride back the way you came." Dale Granger looked at the rifle and then at her with an expression that was meant to be reassuring and landed as something quite different. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "there is no call for alarm. We are simply making a business proposal." "You have made it," she said. "I have declined it. The conversation is finished." It was at this precise moment that Cyrus Sheridan came riding up from the east, which was the direction of the fence line, because he had been checking fence posts in the eastern pasture and had seen the Granger horses go past on the road that ran between the properties and had recognized them, because he had been in the territory long enough to know who the Granger brothers were, and he had a feeling about where they were going and why. He came up at an easy pace and stopped his horse a few yards from the Grangers and looked at the situation with a calm, assessing expression that had nothing theatrical about it. "Morning," he said to Dale and Holt Granger. "Sheridan," Dale said, with less comfort than he had shown a moment before. "Morning, Sallie," Cyrus said, and the easy, familiar use of her first name was entirely deliberate, and she understood why and was grateful for it. "Good morning, Cyrus," she said. Cyrus looked at the Grangers with the patient stillness of a man who has decided how long he is willing to sit in one place. "I expect you are heading back to your own property," he said. It was not a question. Dale looked from Cyrus to Sallie and back, and he performed a brief internal calculation, and he made the decision that was available to him. "We are neighborly men," Dale said, pulling his horse around. "Just passing through." "Good," Cyrus said, and waited until they had ridden off the property and back to the main road before he dismounted and walked to where Sallie was standing. She lowered the rifle and looked at him, and there was a complicated set of things in her expression. Gratitude and something fiercer than gratitude, and also the specific irritation of a woman who is self-sufficient and knows it and resents needing anything. "I had the situation managed," she said. "You did," he agreed, without a trace of argument. "I do not need someone to ride in and handle my problems." "You handled it," he said. "I just happened to be in the area." She looked at him for a long moment. "You did not just happen to be in the area." "No," he said honestly. "I saw them ride past and I had a feeling." She let out a long breath through her nose and looked off toward the north where the Granger horses were disappearing into the distance. "They will come back," she said. "Men like that always do when they have decided on something." "Probably," he said, "but there are things to be done about it. The federal marshal's office in Guthrie keeps a log of complaints. If enough people file them, the Grangers become a priority. Have others filed? 3 other homesteaders to the south that I am aware of," he said. "I made it my business to find out." She looked at him again, and this time the fierceness in her expression had shifted into something harder to name, something that sat alongside gratitude and complicated it. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you make it your business?" He stood there in the October morning with his hat in his hands, the way he had stood at her door with the venison stew, and he looked at her with a directness that did not flinch. "Because your welfare matters to me," he said simply. "I do not intend to be a problem about it, Sallie. I am not asking for anything, but I would be dishonest if I said I did not care what happens to you." The honesty of it was almost more difficult to manage than anything complicated or circuitous would have been. "I think you should go back to your property," she said quietly. "All right," he said, and he put his hat on and he went, and Sallie stood in the golden October yard for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded, and she was furious with herself for the complicated ache it left. She filed the complaint with the marshal's office the following week, and she sent a letter to Pete's son in Guthrie asking him to look into the Granger record, and she reinforced the locks on the barn and the house, and she managed, as she had always managed, and she did not see Cyrus Sheridan for 10 days, and she told herself that the absence was not something she noticed. She noticed. The November rain came in sideways and cold, and turned the Oklahoma roads into rivers of red mud, and the cattle needed supplemental feed because the grass had gone spare, and Pete developed a cough that she did not like the sound of, and she made him rest and took on his work herself, and she was bone-tired in the deep way that goes beyond the body into the parts of a person that sustain everything else. She was fixing a leak in the barn roof in the rain, on a ladder with nails in her mouth and her hat plastered to her head with water, when she heard horse hooves in the yard below. She looked down and Cyrus was there in the rain, looking up at her. "You are fixing the roof in the rain," he said. "The rain is what identified the problem," she said, around the nails. He got off his horse and tied it to the post and came to the base of the ladder and looked up at her. "Let me do that." "I am doing it," she said. "Sallie." Something in the way he said her name, not commanding, not pleading, just present, just fully, quietly present, made her stop moving on the ladder and look down at him again. "You are soaked through," he said. "You are exhausted. I can see it from down here. Let me fix the roof." "It is my roof," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I am not arguing about that. I am asking you to come down off that ladder in the rain and let me fix it, and then you can go inside and get warm, and that is all that this is." She stayed on the ladder for another moment, and the rain came down on both of them, and she thought about how tired she was, and how the tiredness was not just in her arms but in the very center of her, and she climbed down. She went inside and changed into dry clothes and put the kettle on, and through the barn window she could see the lamp she had left burning in there moving as Cyrus worked, steady and purposeful in the rain, and she stood in the kitchen for a while watching that light and feeling something she had been refusing to feel for months. When he was done, he knocked on the door and she opened it, and he was wet enough that water was running off the brim of his hat in a continuous stream. "It will hold until you can have it done properly in dry weather," he said. "The section on the south side needs new boards, but the nails I added will get it through the winter." "Coming out of the rain," she said, and the words came out before she had decided to say them. He stood in her kitchen doorway, and she handed him a towel from the hook by the door, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the rain hammering on the newly repaired roof, and there was something about the ordinary domesticity of it that was more frightening to Sallie than the Granger brothers had been. "How is Pete?" he asked. "Coughing," she said. "I have made him rest. He argues about it." "He seems like a man who would," Cyrus said. "He is the most stubborn person I have ever known," she said, "and I say that with great affection." Cyrus smiled at that, the real one that reached his eyes rather than the polite version, and she had learned to know the difference. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine," she said automatically. He waited. She looked at her coffee. "Tired," she admitted, because he had just fixed her roof in the rain and the least she could offer was honesty. "I know," he said. "I am not asking for pity," she said, with a flicker of the defensive fire that was her most reliable armor. "I am not offering pity," he said, with a patience that was somehow more disarming than agreement would have been. "I am just sitting with you, if that is all right." It was all right. That was the problem. It was the most all right thing she had encountered in longer than she wanted to count, and she was very deeply afraid of how all right it was. She set down her coffee cup and looked at him squarely, because she was not a woman who could hold a feeling inside herself without eventually meeting it directly. "Cyrus," she said, "I need to say something honestly." "Then say it," he said, in the same simple way he said most things. "I think you have developed feelings for me," she said, "beyond neighborly regard." "And I think I have. I do not want to pretend otherwise. I think there is something on my side as well. But I am so tired." The words came out with the weight of everything they carried. "I have started over twice. I have built something twice and watched it be taken from me twice, and I am not sure I have it in me to do it again. I am not sure there is enough of me left that has not already been used up." He was quiet for long enough that the rain shifted in pitch on the roof. "I hear you," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I am not being modest. I am genuinely, completely exhausted by the idea of beginning again." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said in the low, unhurried voice that she had come to know as his most honest register, "Then let me do the starting." She looked at him. "You do not have to begin anything," he said. "You have already done enough beginning for several lifetimes. I am not asking you to summon up some reserve that you have already spent. I am asking you to let me bring it to you. Let me be the one who starts. All you have to do is decide whether you want to let me in. That is all." She felt the words move through her like water finding a place it had been looking for, and she could not speak for a moment, and the rain fell on the repaired roof above them, and the lamp light was warm, and she looked at this man who had ridden up from Texas with his bay horse and his good cooking and his quiet, absolute decency. And she thought about Thomas, and she thought about Edmund, and she thought about everything she had lost and everything she had built back up from nothing. And she thought about the long, tired ache of doing everything alone. "You do not know what you are proposing," she said finally. "I know exactly what I am proposing," he said. "I am proposing that you let someone take care of some things for a while. Not all things, not your land or your choices or who you are, just some things." "That is not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not, but I think you are worth the effort." She looked at him for a long time in the warm kitchen light with the rain going on above them and the coffee getting cold. "I cannot promise you anything," she said. "Not yet. I need time to know what I feel." "I have time," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she nodded slowly. "Then we will see," she said. It was not a declaration of anything, but it was the first crack in the wall, and they both knew it. And he drank the rest of his coffee and went out into the evening rain and rode back to his property. And Sallie sat at the kitchen table alone and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the caution, something she had almost forgotten the name for. Something like hope, small and new and a little frightening, like a fire just started in a cold room. The winter came and buried Oklahoma under gray skies and frozen creek edges, and the kind of cold that made the mornings an act of will. Pete's cough resolved itself in December, which was a relief, and Denny came out less often because the roads were difficult. But the cattle were fed, and the fences held, and the barn roof did not leak again. Sallie and Cyrus moved through the winter in their neighboring existence with a new quality to it, not dramatically changed, not suddenly effusive, but warmer, more deliberate, more honestly present than the careful distance of the summer and fall. He brought her firewood in November before the deep cold hit, a full cord stacked against the side of the house, and he did not make a production of it, just appeared one afternoon while she was doing accounts in the house, and she went to the window when she heard the axe and watched him splitting wood in the cold air with the steady rhythmic patience that characterized everything he did. She did not tell him to stop. In December, she invited him for supper on a Thursday evening. She cooked a proper meal, roasted chicken and biscuits, and an apple pie that came from apples she had preserved in the fall. And they sat at the table and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about cattle prices and territorial politics, and what Christmas had been like in their respective childhoods. And she learned that he had grown up in a small town outside San Antonio, the eldest of 4 children. That his father had been a carpenter, and his mother had been the woman with the survival skill philosophy about cooking, and that he had come north partly for land, and partly because Texas had gotten complicated for him, after a woman he had expected to marry had changed her mind 4 years earlier, and he said this without drama or self-pity, just as a fact. "Were you very hurt?" she asked. "I was," he said honestly, "for a while. Then I was just different from who I had been before it, which is, I think, how it always works." "Yes," she said, "that is how it works." He helped her wash the dishes after supper, which again surprised her, because it was not a thing men typically did in her experience, and she said so, and he said, "My mother had 4 children and cooked every meal." It seemed unfair not to help, and she thought about his mother, this practical, clear-sighted woman she had never met and would never meet, and she felt a kind of distant affection for her. It snowed on Christmas Eve, and they were both on their own properties, as was appropriate, and Sallie sat by her fire and read by lamplight, and felt the quiet of the house around her, which she had learned over the years to regard as peace rather than loneliness, though sometimes it was hard to be entirely certain which it was. On Christmas Day she looked out her east window in the morning, and saw a wreath of dried wildflowers hanging on the fence post at the boundary between their properties, the post nearest to her house, carefully placed so she would see it. She stood at the window for a long time looking at it, and then she went and found a jar of the apple preserves she had made in the fall and walked it to the same fence post and set it there and went back inside. And when she looked out the window an hour later, the jar was gone. She smiled, alone in her kitchen on Christmas morning, and it was a real smile, the kind that surprised her. January brought news from Guthrie that the federal marshal's office had taken formal action against the Granger brothers. 3 homesteaders' complaints combined with evidence of their involvement in a cattle theft operation further south had been enough to bring charges, and both Dale and Holt Granger were now in custody in Guthrie, awaiting territorial court proceedings. Pete's son had written to confirm it, and Sallie read the letter at the kitchen table with a feeling of thorough, settled relief. She walked the letter over to Cyrus's property herself that afternoon, because she knew he would want to know, and because she wanted to tell him in person rather than send word with Pete. He was in his barn when she arrived, working on a bridle at the workbench, and he looked up when she came in out of the cold, and something shifted in his expression that she had learned to recognize the particular quality of attention he gave her that he did not give to anyone or anything else. She held out the letter. He read it and then set it down on the workbench. "That is good news," he said. "It is," she said. "I thought you should know." "Thank you for bringing it," he said. They stood in the barn with the cold pressing at the walls and the horses moving quietly in their stalls, and she looked at him in the way she had been looking at him for months now, which was to say fully, without the peripheral guarding she had been maintaining since October. "Cyrus," she said. He waited. "I have been thinking about what you said in November," she said. "About starting." "I remember what I said," he said. I have been letting you," she said, which came out less grammatically precise than she intended, but he understood it immediately because he was a man who paid attention. "I know," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I see it," she said. "The wood and the roof and the Grangers and all of it. I want you to know I am not taking it for granted. I do not do those things to be noticed," he said. "I know you do not," she said. "That is exactly why I notice." He set down the bridle and turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that was careful and hopeful and honest all at once, and she took a breath and said what she had been moving toward saying since November. "I am still tired," she said. "I want to be honest about that. The tiredness has not gone anywhere. But I think," she paused, because she was precise about language and she wanted to be precise about this. "I think that what you have been doing since November has been making it slightly less impossible to imagine, and I wanted to say that." He crossed the space between them in 2 slow steps, and he stood close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and he said, "Can I hold your hand?" It was such a specific, careful, completely characteristic request that she almost laughed, and she said, "Yes," and he took her hand in both of his. His hands were warm despite the cold barn, the hands of someone who worked hard and lived honestly, and he held it and looked at her and did not say anything for a while. "I am going to be very patient," he said eventually. "I know you are," she said. "And I am going to be here," he said. "Not going anywhere, just here." "I know that too," she said. He lifted her hand briefly and pressed his lips to it with a formality that was completely sincere, and she felt it move through her whole body like a cord, and then he released her hand and she walked back through the cold January afternoon to her own house and stood in her kitchen with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat. There it was. After all this time, there it was. February and March passed the way the early year always passed in the territory, slowly, with the land waiting to remember itself, and the days getting lighter by increments so small you could only measure them in retrospect. Cyrus came for supper twice more in February, and she rode over to his property once to look at a section of his cattle that were showing signs of a respiratory illness, and to share the remedy she had developed in her own herd over the years, and he listened to her with the complete attention he gave everything she said, as if the information mattered not only because it was practically useful, but because it came from her. By March they were holding hands when they walked the fence line together, which had become a regular feature of Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, Pete knowing about it now, and saying nothing because Pete was wise enough to know when to keep his counsel, and Sallie had arrived at a place she had not expected to arrive at, which was genuine happiness. Not the satisfied management of grief happiness she had maintained for years, but the warmer, fuller kind, the kind that makes the mornings feel different. She talked to Thomas's grave in April, which was something she did sometimes. Standing at the small stone marker she had placed at the eastern edge of the home plot under an oak tree. She told Thomas about Cyrus, because it seemed right to do, and she stood there in the April wind with the new grass coming up green around the stone, and she felt, for the first time since Thomas had died, that the grief and the new love were not enemies of each other, that a person could hold both without one canceling the other out, that love was not a finite resource that ran out but something that grew in new directions if you could bear to let it. She felt the same about Edmund. She carried them both, and she always would, and there was room for something new alongside that carrying. That was what she understood in April under the oak tree. She told Cyrus about this on a Sunday afternoon walk, not the cemetery visit itself but the understanding it had produced, and he listened without interruption and then said, "Do you think Thomas would have liked me?" The question surprised a laugh out of her, a real one. "Thomas would have interrogated you for 2 hours about your cattle management practices and then decided you were adequate," she said. "High praise," Cyrus said. "Very," she agreed. He stopped walking and turned toward her there on the grass with the April sun warm and the cottonwoods along the creek putting out their first pale leaves, and he looked at her with everything he felt visible in his face because he was not a man who hid things. "Sallie," he said, "I love you." She had known it was coming and she had thought she was prepared for it, and she found that she was not quite as prepared as she had believed, because the words in his voice, in this specific afternoon light, with everything that had passed between them since that October kitchen, it was more than she had arranged herself for. "Cyrus," she said. "You do not have to say anything back," he said immediately. "I am not saying it to ask for a response. I am saying it because it is true and I want you to know it is true. That is all." She looked at him for a long moment and then she reached up and put her hand against his face, against the jaw she had noticed in Chickasha on that first morning in a lifetime ago, and she felt him go very still under her hand. "I love you too," she said. "I have been frightened too, but I do." He turned his face and pressed his lips to her palm the same way he had pressed them to her hand in January. And then he pulled her against him and held her there in the April afternoon, with the creek running nearby and the horses somewhere in the south pasture, and the whole territory spread out golden green around them. And she put her arms around him and let herself be held, really held, for the first time in 2 years, and it was extraordinary and overwhelming and exactly right. He kissed her for the first time properly after, standing on the porch of her house as the April evening came on, and it was the kind of kiss that is also a conversation careful at first, then more certain, then full of all the patience and the October kitchen and the Christmas wreath and the wood and the long winter and everything that had been built between them over the past year, without either of them saying clearly that they were building anything. "I want to do this properly," he said, when they pulled apart. "What do you mean, properly?" she asked. "I mean I want to court you," he said, formally. "I want to call on you and sit on this porch and bring you flowers when the wildflowers come in and take you to dinner in Chickasha and do all of it the way it should be done." "Cyrus," she said, amused and touched at once, "we have been neighbors for a year. I have fixed fence posts with you." "I know," he said, "and I would not trade any of that, but I still want to do it properly. You deserve properly." She considered him in the porch light, this patient, deliberate, thoroughly good man, and she said, "All right, do it properly." He called on her the following Saturday with wildflowers he had found coming up along the creek. Not cultivated flowers, but the real Oklahoma spring variety, purple and yellow and small and impractical and perfect. He took her to dinner at the Chickasha Hotel dining room in May, and she wore a dark green dress that had been her best dress for years, and he wore a clean white shirt and a dark coat, and they sat across from each other over a proper meal, and talked the way they always talked, which was to say honestly and at length, and with the comfortable quality of two people who had already established that they were safe with each other. Clara Simmons saw them at the hotel and her expression could only be described as deeply gratified, and she said nothing beyond good evening because she was not entirely without discretion. He proposed in June. He had not, as far as Sallie could tell, planned it dramatically. They were at the fence line at sunset in the way they had been at the fence line on countless evenings, and he had been quieter than usual all afternoon, and she had noticed but said nothing, and then he stopped walking and said her name, and she turned to look at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to spend the rest of my life being your neighbor and more than your neighbor. I want to wake up and know that you are in the world and that I get to be part of your life in the largest possible way. I know everything that the word marriage costs, especially for you. I am asking you to let me be worth that cost." She stood in the June evening with the sky behind him going amber and rose, and she looked at Cyrus Sheridan, 32 years old now, and steady in every particular and more fully known to her than anyone had been in a very long time. And she thought about tired and about starting and about all of it, and she said, "Yes." He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for some time, and he held both her hands, and they stood at the fence line between their properties in the warm June evening, while the sky turned dark and the first stars appeared. And she thought that this was the kind of happiness that did not ask you to forget anything, that let everything you had already lived be part of what you were, and that was exactly what she needed it to be. They were married in September of 1883. The ceremony was at the small church in Chickasha, presided over by the minister, who had also presided over both of Sallie's previous marriages, which he navigated with considerable pastoral grace. Pete Oak stood up for Cyrus, on the grounds that Pete had known Cyrus long enough and trusted him completely by this point, which was not nothing from Pete. Clara Simmons stood up for Sallie and cried with the unabashed enthusiasm of someone who had been invested in this outcome for quite some time. Denny came down from school in Guthrie, where he had been going since spring, grown tall and serious, in the way that 17-year-old boys become serious when they are close to becoming men. And he sat in the front pew and looked at his aunt with the warm, uncomplicated happiness of someone who loves a person and wants them to be all right. Sallie wore a cream-colored dress that she and Clara had made together over the summer, nothing elaborate, nothing that was trying too hard, but good fabric properly made and fitted, and she wore a small spray of late wildflowers in her hair, and she stood at the front of the church next to Cyrus with her heart open in the way she had been afraid it no longer could be. And she said the words she had said twice before in this same territory. And this time she said them with the particular clarity of someone who has come through the fire and knows exactly what she is choosing. Cyrus said his vows looking at her with the complete, unguarded honesty that was the most characteristic thing about him, and his voice was steady and low and entirely sincere. And Pete produced a ring that Cyrus had had made by the jeweler in Chickasha, a simple band with a small turquoise stone set in it that was the color of the Oklahoma sky on a clear October morning. And when Cyrus put it on her finger, she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him. And everything she felt was in her face. After the ceremony, there was a supper in the church hall that had been organized primarily by Clara, and was accordingly more thorough than anyone had expected. 3 long tables of food, music provided by a fiddler from the south of town, and most of the community of Chickasha in attendance, because Sallie Walker had lived among these people for 4 years and they liked and respected her, and they had seen her get back up more than once. And they were genuinely glad to celebrate something good happening to her. Cyrus danced with her twice, which given the setting and the occasion was practically restrained. And she danced with Pete and with Denny and with Clara's husband, and she laughed more that evening than she had laughed in years. The unguarded, head-back kind of laughing that means everything is genuinely fine. They went home to her house that night, because the question of whose house and whose property had been discussed and resolved practically. They would live in hers, which was the established property with the garden and the proper cellar and the spring water, and Cyrus would bring his horses and his essential equipment, and they would manage both properties together and eventually fold the Alderman parcel into the Walker operation properly. He had no strong attachment to the Alderman house beyond its functional value, and practical decisions made on practical grounds were entirely comfortable to both of them. The merger of two cattle operations was something Sallie had thought about with the organized thoroughness she brought to every practical problem, and it went better than either of them had anticipated because Cyrus's cattle were healthy and his practices were sound, and there were no significant conflicts in how they each ran their herds. Pete, who had been skeptical about everything for 20 years on principle, declared Cyrus an acceptable addition to the operation within 3 weeks, which was as effusive as Pete ever got, and which Sallie relayed to Cyrus with considerable amusement. Marriage to Cyrus turned out to be different from her previous marriages in ways that she had not quite prepared for, not worse ways, but unexpected ones. Thomas had been her great love of youth, the love that shapes everything after it, fierce and hopeful and not yet acquainted with loss. Edmund had been a partnership, warm and respectful, and built on shared grief and practical need. Cyrus was something she had not had before, which was the love of a woman who knew herself fully, the love that comes when you have been through enough to know what you actually need and value rather than what you hoped for, and when the person in front of you meets those specific, honest needs in real and daily ways. He was a good husband in all the ways she needed him to be. He was steady. He kept his word. He did not require managing or handling. He talked to her about things that mattered and listened when she talked, and he picked his battles with the wisdom of someone who understood that not every disagreement was worth having, and when they did disagree, which they did, they were both people with considerable opinions. He fought fair and remained himself, and did not say things to wound. He still cooked, which she considered a significant quality of character, and they developed a domestic rhythm that was comfortable and warm, with the large and small details of two lives becoming one life in the gradual, unromantic, genuinely beautiful way that actual love operates. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold but manageable, and they managed it together, and she had occasion to think often about the November kitchen and the rain on the repaired roof and everything she had been afraid to want, and she thought about it with a gratitude so deep it had nowhere to go except to move through her quietly like water. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 3 weeks and confirmed it with enough practical certainty before she said anything, and she told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning because Tuesday mornings were ordinary and she was a woman who had learned to be careful about good things, careful not to invest too much too soon, though she could feel already that the caution was losing to something larger. Cyrus put down his coffee cup and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair and took her hands and looked up at her with an expression that had something odd in it that she had not seen from him before, and she realized that this was new for him in a way it was not for her. She had been pregnant once before, briefly, a pregnancy that had not continued, early in her marriage to Edmund, and there was grief in that history too, but Cyrus had never faced this particular enormity. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you frightened?" "Some," she said honestly. "Me too," he said. "You," she said, because she had come to think of Cyrus as substantially unfrightened by most things. "Having someone depend on me that completely," he said. "Getting it right, being the kind of father." He stopped and she saw him working through something private. "My father was not a bad man, but he was not present in the ways that mattered. I have thought about that my whole life." "Cyrus," she said. She put her hand on his face as she had in April under the cottonwoods. "You will get it right." "You cannot know that," he said. "I know you," she said. "That amounts to knowing it." He pressed his forehead briefly to her hands, and then stood up and sat back in his chair, and there was a quality in the kitchen light that morning that Sallie would remember for the rest of her life. They told Pete, who produced an expression of such profound satisfaction that Sallie almost felt she should apologize for how long it had taken. They told Denny in a letter to Guthrie, and Denny wrote back with the misspelled enthusiasm of a young man who was genuinely delighted. They told Clara Simmons on the next Tuesday trip to the general store, and Clara cried, which was not surprising. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer of 1884 was punishing in its heat, and Sallie was not as young as she had been, and there were weeks when the exhaustion was so thorough that she could barely manage the essential tasks, and she found herself having to let Cyrus do significantly more than her independence was comfortable with, and she had to keep choosing to let him, which was its own ongoing act. He never made it feel like a weight. He managed the cattle and the fencing and the barn work, and he cooked on the days when standing over a stove was beyond her, and he sat with her in the evenings on the porch when the air was its most bearable, and he read to her from the novels she kept on the shelf by the fireplace. She was a reader, had always been a reader. This was something Thomas had loved about her, and Edmund had quietly respected, and Cyrus read well, with a natural sense of pace. And she would sit in the growing warmth of her own body and listen and feel the evenings settle around them. And she thought that this was the thing she had been too tired to start, and that he had started for her, and it had grown into this. Their son was born in October of 1884. He came in a long night that turned into an early morning, with the October wind in the cottonwoods and Clara Simmons there, because she had learned midwifery in addition to everything else she did, and Cyrus outside in the yard walking the perimeter of the house, because Clara had firmly put him outside, and there he was, walking, in the way of men throughout history who have found themselves completely powerless in the face of the most important thing. The baby was healthy and loud and had a considerable amount of dark hair and Cyrus's nose, and when Clara brought him to Cyrus on the porch, he stood very still looking at this specific new person, and there were tears on his face that he did not try to do anything about. They named him Thomas Cyrus Sheridan, and Sallie held him in the October morning light with the gold of the grasslands coming through the window. And she thought about Thomas Walker, who had stood in a land office in the early days of the territory, and signed his name to 320 acres of possibility. And she thought about Edmund, who had been good and steady and gone too soon. And she thought about the woman she had been at that fence line in November of 1882, who had decided she was done. And she thought about all of it with the wholeness of someone who can look at the full shape of their own life. Cyrus came and sat beside her on the bed and looked at Thomas Cyrus Sheridan, and then he looked at Sallie with everything he had in him visible on his face. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby blinked at him with the unfocused ancient attention of new people. "He is remarkable," Cyrus said. "He is objectively very similar to every other newborn," Sallie said, and then immediately, "He is perfect." Cyrus laughed, low and warm, and put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned against him with the baby between them and the October light on all three of them. Life on the Walker Sheridan property, which is what people in Chickasha began to call it, naturally, over time, a simple acknowledgement of how things had organized themselves, took on the fullness that comes with a child in the house. Thomas Cyrus grew through the seasons with the robust and energetic determination of a person who has been delivered into the world with considerable opinions about it, and he occupied the property with increasing authority as he found his feet, and then found his voice, which he used extensively. Pete Oakes, who had been skeptical about children with the same thoroughness he had initially been skeptical about Cyrus, was comprehensively undone by Thomas Cyrus by the time the boy was 18 months old. The child had identified Pete as a person of particular interest and followed him around the yard with the devoted focus of a new apprentice. And Pete, whose own grandchildren were far away in Kansas, received this attention with a gruffness that fooled nobody. Denny finished his schooling in Guthrie in 1885 and came back to the territory with the specific purpose of establishing himself on adjacent land, and Cyrus and Sallie helped him navigate the claims process and the practical difficulties of getting started. And Cyrus spent 2 weekends helping Denny put up a proper fence line and make the initial repairs to the small house on the claim. And Sallie watched this and felt the fullness of things that have grown into more than you planned. The Granger brothers were tried in the territorial court in the spring of 1885. Dale received 18 months. Holt, whose involvement in the cattle theft operation was more thoroughly documented, received 3 years. The homesteaders who had been watching their movements with anxiety for years felt the settled relief of a situation properly concluded, and Sallie received a formal written notice from the marshal's office confirming the disposition of the case. And she folded the letter neatly and put it in the cedar box with the property documents and the marriage certificate. And that was the end of that. The summer of 1885 was one of the best summers Sallie could remember on the Walker Sheridan land. The rains came in measured and sufficient amounts, which in Oklahoma territory was not something you could count on, and the grass grew thick, and the cattle were healthy, and the creek ran well past the July point where it usually turned shallow. And Thomas Cyrus was learning to walk with the whole-body commitment of a child who is not interested in doing anything halfway. And Cyrus had a habit in the long summer evenings of taking the boy out to look at the horses, holding him up at the corral fence, while the boy pointed at the animals with the delighted imperious authority of a small person who has discovered that horses are an excellent thing. She would stand at the kitchen window and watch them, man and boy at the corral in the evening light, and she would feel the warmth of it move through her in the way that had surprised her once and now felt familiar and necessary, the way breathing felt necessary. He still told her he loved her every day. Not performatively, not as a ritual that had lost its content, but in the specific, particular, genuine way that he did most things, finding a natural moment and saying it with the same honesty he had brought to every word between them. She said it back in kind, and it was always true, and it was always different because love in a life is never the same thing twice. It changes shape with everything that happens and grows into new parts of you as you live. She told Clara Simmons in the fall of 1885 that she was expecting again, and Clara's expression was of such luminous satisfaction that Sallie had to turn away to compose herself. "You are not going to say I told you so," Sallie said. "I would never say that," Clara said, which was not even slightly true, and they both knew it, and Sallie laughed in the way she did now, freely, with the whole of herself. The second baby came in the spring of 1886, a girl this time, born on a March morning when the ice was just going off the creek, and the first green was coming tentatively into the world. She was smaller than Thomas Cyrus had been and entirely certain of herself from the first moment, and they named her Margaret Edmund Sheridan, the second name for Edmund Ferris, who had been kind and deserved to be remembered, and Sallie felt the rightness of including him, felt that he would have been glad. Thomas Cyrus, at 1.5 years, regarded his sister with the suspicious concentration of a small person reassessing his position, and then with the gradually warming interest of someone who has realized that the new development might be entertaining, and eventually, with the passionate protectiveness of an elder sibling who has taken the job extremely seriously. Pete Oakes retired from active cattle work in 1886 because his knee had finally decided it was done, but he did not leave. He moved into a small room off the back of the main house that Cyrus had extended and fitted out properly, and he continued to sit on the porch and offer opinions about the cattle and the fence and the weather and anything else that seemed to require an opinion. And he was company in the quiet way that Pete had always been company, solid and reliable and quietly affectionate, in the way of people who do not make a fuss about affection. Denny married a young woman from Chickasha named Alice in 1887, a schoolteacher with red hair and a direct way of speaking that reminded Sallie pleasantly of herself at that age. And the wedding supper was held at the Walker Sheridan property, and there were 3 long tables in the yard, and Cyrus made stew and Clara brought bread, and the whole community came, and the children ran in the grass in the long summer evening. And Sallie sat beside Cyrus at the table, and he put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand under his and held it. And she looked around the yard at all of it. The tables and the light, and Pete asleep in his chair in the corner, with a child on his knee, and Denny and Alice laughing with their heads together, and the last of the sun on the grasslands. And she thought that this was the thing she had been too tired for, this exact abundance. And she was so profoundly, completely glad she had been wrong about what she had left. She said something like this to Cyrus that night, after the guests were gone and the children were asleep, and the yard was quiet with the summer dark. They were sitting on the porch, which had become their place, the place where the day concluded, and they said the things that required the particular privacy of a shared evening. And she was leaning against his shoulder, which she did with the same ease now as drawing breath. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "When I told you I was too tired, I was not wrong to feel it. I was genuinely that tired. I want to be clear about that." "I know you were," he said, "but I was wrong about it being the end of things," she said. "I thought there was nothing left. And you," she stopped, and she was precise about language, and she wanted to be precise about this too. "You were very careful with what I had," she said. "You did not demand that I produce something from an empty place. You brought it in from the outside and let it build back up. I do not know if I have said that correctly." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark yard where the fireflies had started in the tall grass. "You said it exactly right," he said. "I love you," she said. "I know it," he said. "And you know I love you." "I know it," she said. They sat on the porch in the summer dark for a long time after that, not talking, the way two people can sit when the silence between them is entirely full. The years that followed were the years of a life thoroughly and properly lived. Oklahoma Territory moved toward statehood with the slow, contentious progress that defined that particular political process. And the world around the Walker Sheridan property continued to change and push and complicate itself, with the relentless energy of a territory becoming a state, becoming a place. And Sallie and Cyrus paid attention to all of it and argued about some of it, and managed their piece of it with the competence and care they had always brought. The cattle operation expanded, slowly and deliberately, in the way that Cyrus did most things, not with the ambition that overreaches, but with the patient building of something intended to last. They bought adjacent land when it became available in 1888, adding 160 acres to the east that pushed their boundary further into the grasslands. And the combined operation employed 3 full-time hands by 1890, and was producing consistently enough that Sallie, who kept the accounts with meticulous thoroughness, could see the trajectory clearly, and found it entirely satisfying. Thomas Cyrus grew into a boy who was his father's hands and his mother's mind, which was a particularly effective combination, and he was fascinated by everything about the cattle operation by the time he was 6 and 8 and 10. Following Cyrus on the cattle work with the same devoted apprentice energy he had once directed at Pete. And Cyrus taught him everything with the patience that had always been Cyrus's most identifiable quality, without impatience and without expectation. Just the clear, generous transmission of knowledge from a man who loved this work to a boy who was going to love it too. Margaret grew into a person of such startling determination and intelligence that she regularly astonished everyone around her. And she decided by the age of 7 that she was going to be a school teacher like Denny's Alice. And she pursued this decision with the organized purposefulness of someone who had already looked at the landscape of her future and made her choices, which Sallie recognized with enormous affection as a quality she had herself. Pete Oakes died in 1891, peacefully in the room off the back of the house, on a cold February morning, and Sallie and Cyrus and the children stood at the small graveside service in the churchyard in Chickasha, and felt the specific grief of losing someone who had been a fixture of life for so long that the loss of them is also the loss of a version of yourself. Pete had been part of the Walker land since Thomas was alive, had been Sallie's constant and reliable presence through everything, had been the first person to extend genuine welcome to Cyrus, and he had lived his last years in the warmth of the household he had helped to build without meaning to, and there was peace in that as well as grief, and Sallie held both. Cyrus gave the eulogy at Pete's service. He had not prepared remarks so much as simply spoken from the specific knowledge of a man he had respected, and he spoke about Pete's stubbornness, and his loyalty, and the way he had always known more than he said. And the congregation in the small church received it with the recognition of people who had known Pete Oakes and found it accurate. And Sallie sat in the pew with her hand in Cyrus's, and felt the way grief and love occupy the same space and make each other larger. They planted a cottonwood by Pete's grave, because Pete had always favored the cottonwoods along the creek, had said they made a reasonable noise in the wind. Life continued. It continued in the large way and in the small way, in the seasons and the cattle and the accounts and the porch evenings and the meals and the children growing into the people they had always been going to be, and in the way that a love that has been built carefully and honestly continues, not with the dramatic urgency of its beginning, but with the deep, settled, daily quality that is the most underrated form of happiness available. Sallie turned 40 in 1889, and Cyrus turned 40 in 1892, and neither of these events distressed either of them in the way they might have distressed people who had not come through as much on the way to those numbers. They were, by this point, the kind of married that is visible in how two people occupy a room together. The awareness of each other that does not require looking, the reflexive consideration that has become part of the body's knowledge, and their children grew up inside this particular weather and considered it normal, which was exactly what Sallie and Cyrus hoped for them. Thomas Cyrus was 18 in 1902, and he had grown into a young man of considerable quality, capable and thoughtful, and honest in the way his father was honest, with the steady ground-level competence that comes from growing up doing real work alongside people who care about doing it right. He was already managing significant portions of the cattle operation by the time he was 16, and by 18, it was clear that the land would be in good hands. Margaret was 16 in 1902, and she was already corresponding with a normal school in Guthrie about her education, with the focused energy of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is annoyed at the time it takes to get there. Cyrus had helped her compose the letters with the care he brought to anything involving his children, and Sallie had read them and made precisely targeted suggestions, and the result was correspondence that was clear and compelling and entirely Margaret's own. Denny and Alice had 3 children of their own by this point, and the family gatherings at the Walker Sheridan property at Christmas and at harvest time had the warm, crowded, slightly chaotic quality of a family that has grown into itself, with children running in the yard that Thomas had built and repaired and expanded, and the tables that came out under the sky on good evenings when there were too many people for the house, and food that came from several different kitchens and was better for it. Sallie was 53 years old in 1902, and she sat on the porch in the October evening with the grasslands gone gold the way they always went in October, the same gold that she had noticed with Thomas on their first fall in this country, and that she had noticed every fall since. And the world was the same and entirely different from everything it had been, and she was tired in the good way, the way that comes from a full day in a full life. And Cyrus came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee, the way he had been sitting beside her with 2 cups of coffee for nearly 20 years. "Look at it," she said, meaning the gold. "I know," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the evening came on around them, and the lamps came on in the house behind them where Thomas Cyrus was at the table doing his reading and Margaret's light was on in her room, where she was almost certainly working on her correspondence with the normal school, and the horses were in the pasture, and the cattle were on the East Range, and the creek was running at its autumn level, and everything that had ever mattered was accounted for, every thread resolved, every grief carried and integrated, Every hope that had seemed too expensive to hold now simply the ordinary furniture of a life. "I used to think I had nothing left," Sallie said. "I know you did," Cyrus said. "You were very sure of yourself," she said, not with criticism, just with the observation of a woman who had been watching him be precisely who he was for a long time. "Not sure of myself," he said. "Sure of you. There is a difference." She thought about this for a moment and found it accurate. He had not been sure that she would love him or that it would work or that the tiredness could be navigated. He had been sure of something in her, some quality, some capacity, something he had seen from the beginning. And he had trusted that, and he had been right, and she had benefited from his conviction when she could not hold any of her own. "That is a considerable thing to have done for me," she said. "You did the harder part," he said. "What part did I do?" "You let me," he said. "That was the harder part." She thought about the rainy November kitchen and the Christmas wreath and the January barn and the April fence line and everything that had come between and after. And she thought about all the moments of choice, the small ones and the large ones, all the individual decisions to stay open when closing would have been easier, and she thought he was probably right. "I love you, Cyrus Sheridan," she said. "I love you, Sallie Walker Sheridan," he said, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and the last of the light went out of the October sky above the golden grasslands of Oklahoma, and the stars came up in the enormous western dark, and everything was, thoroughly and completely, all right.